The Pacific War had seen plenty of desperate moments, but September 12, 1942, on Guadalcanal would prove to be something altogether different. Lieutenant Colonel Red Mike Edson stood before his 800 Marines, men who were tired, running low on ammunition, and facing what seemed impossible. Intelligence reports had just arrived with grim news. Somewhere out in that dark jungle, 2,500 Japanese troops were moving toward them, preparing to close in from multiple directions and crush them completely. Every military textbook ever written had a clear answer for this situation. When you're outnumbered 3-1 and facing encirclement, you retreat, you pull back to better defensive terrain, you call for help, and you get your men out. That's what the manuals said, that's what strategy dictated, that's what any reasonable commander would do. But Edson looked at his exhausted Marines and made a decision that nobody in Washington would have predicted. He ordered his men to do the opposite. Instead of pulling back, he told them to tighten their perimeter. Instead of retreating, they would stand their ground, let the enemy come, let them surround the position completely. Through the suffocating darkness and humidity of the Pacific jungle, the Japanese forces began their approach from three sides, absolutely convinced they were about to achieve a devastating victory. What was about to unfold would completely overturn everything military experts thought they knew about defense. A situation that looked hopeless would transform into one of the most remarkable victories in Marine Corps history. The humid tropical air hung so thick you could almost choke on it as evening settled over the ridge on September 13th. Lieutenant Colonel Red Edson moved carefully through the defensive positions, walking with the calm bearing of someone who had already done the math and accepted what might come. He knew the numbers. 800 Marines, 2,500 Japanese soldiers confirmed moving through the jungle below. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving, but Edson had learned long ago that maps and statistics didn't tell you everything about a fight. The ridge itself wasn't much to look at, just a low spine of coral and volcanic rock that climbed maybe 60 feet above the thick jungle surrounding it, stretching roughly 1,000 yards from north to south. Back in Washington, officers studying maps in climate-controlled rooms probably thought it was insignificant, barely worth defending. But to the Marines digging in along its slopes, this piece of ground meant everything. 800 yards to the north sat Henderson Field, the airstrip that was keeping the American presence alive in the South Pacific. If this ridge fell, the Japanese would control the airfield. If they controlled the airfield, the Americans would lose the entire island. The ridge was the difference between holding the line and catastrophic defeat. Edson had placed his forces with the precision of someone playing chess with lives at stake. The 1st Radar Battalion held the northern section, closest to Henderson Field and its vital connection to air support. The 1st Parachute Battalion stretched out along the southern approaches, the area where the Japanese would most likely attack. Between them, they had arranged overlapping fields of fire so that anything moving through the jungle below would be caught in a devastating crossfire. But Edson understood something crucial that many commanders missed. Raw firepower alone wouldn't save them. The Japanese had demonstrated time and again that they would absorb staggering casualties to achieve their objectives. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi had 3 times their numbers and 3 times their determination. The Marines had been fighting on Guadalcanal for more than a month now, and the jungle had been their harshest teacher. The oppressive heat during the day left metal burning hot, and men soaked through their uniforms. At night, condensation made everything slick and clammy. Canvas rotted away within weeks, food spoiled within days. Men lost weight they couldn't spare and contracted tropical diseases that ate away at their strength and endurance. But they'd learned something too. The jungle had peculiar acoustics, and the Marines had begun to understand how sound traveled through the dense undergrowth. They could listen for the subtle signs of movement, the sounds that gave away enemy positions long before you could see them. As Edson moved along the line checking positions, he found Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone working with his machine gun. The Browning M1917 was a relic from the previous war, water-cooled, heavy as anything at 41 pounds without the tripod. But it could maintain a rate of fire that would shred a man to pieces at distances up to 1,500 yards. Basilone had proven himself in every engagement, displaying the kind of steady competence under fire that marked the difference between Marines who'd been tested and the replacements fresh from training camps back home. "How's your ammunition situation, Gunny?" Edson asked, crouching beside the machine gun position. "Enough to make them think twice about coming up this hill, Colonel," Basilone replied, his voice carrying that quiet confidence Edson had learned to trust completely. "Though I wouldn't mind a few more belts if the Japanese decide to really press this." 20 yards to the left, Private First Class Robert McCard had dug in with his Springfield rifle, cleaned and loaded, bayonet attached and ready. He'd arrived on Guadalcanal only 3 weeks earlier, still carrying that soft appearance of stateside training camps, but the jungle had already begun its work on him. His uniform hung loose on his frame now, and his eyes held that particular intensity that came from understanding that death could come from anywhere at any moment, without warning. The Japanese strategy, based on captured documents and intelligence reports, relied on speed and shock. Kawaguchi's forces had spent 3 days moving through the jungle on trails that only their most experienced guides could navigate. The plan called for a coordinated assault from 3 directions, designed to overwhelm the American positions through sheer weight of numbers and the psychological terror of fighting in complete darkness. What the Japanese hadn't counted on was the systematic preparation Edson had completed over the previous week. Every possible approach to the ridge had been studied, measured, measured and pre-registered for artillery fire. The Marines had cut fields of fire through the jungle vegetation, creating killing zones that would funnel attackers into predetermined corridors where Marine firepower could be brought to bear most effectively. Wire obstacles, limited though they were by supply constraints, had been positioned to slow attacking troops and channel them into the best engagement ranges. But the Marines also possessed advantages that would never appear in any Japanese intelligence briefing. Their training emphasized individual thinking and adaptability, qualities that were absolutely crucial in the chaos of night combat. Unlike Japanese infantry, who relied heavily on coordinated group tactics and unified formations, American Marines were trained to fight effectively as individuals when the bigger picture fell apart under fire. They could make decisions on their own. They could adapt to chaos. They could survive when things went wrong. As darkness deepened, the jungle itself began to change. The constant chorus of insects and night creatures gradually faded into an unnatural silence that every experienced Marine recognized immediately. That quiet meant one thing, and one thing only. Contact was coming. Somewhere in the darkness below, thousands of Japanese soldiers were moving into position, creating a disturbance that even the wildlife could sense. Edson made his final rounds through the positions, speaking quietly with squad leaders and verifying ammunition supplies. The Marines had roughly 200 rounds per rifleman, supported by grenades, mortars, and machine guns that would form the backbone of the defense. It wasn't an abundance, but for men who had learned to make every shot count, it would have to be enough. The radio crackled with reports from observation posts scattered through the jungle. Japanese forces had been spotted moving along 3 separate approaches, exactly as the intelligence estimates had predicted. They were assembling for a multi-pronged attack. The enemy was close enough now that voices could occasionally be heard through the undergrowth, speaking in the harsh syllables of Japanese military commands. At 11:45, Japanese mortar rounds began falling on the ridge. The explosions were scattered and poorly coordinated, suggesting that Kawaguchi's forces were still getting into position and attempting to calibrate their indirect fire weapons. But the shelling served its purpose. It announced to every Marine on that ridge that the battle they'd been expecting was finally beginning. Edson took his position at the command post, a shallow depression protected by sandbags at the highest point of the ridge. From here, he could observe the entire length of his defensive line and maintain radio contact with Henderson Field. The airstrip's artillery batteries were standing by, their guns already loaded and trained on predetermined target areas. Then the jungle exploded into chaos. The first wave of Japanese infantry broke from the tree line like a human avalanche, their voices raised in the traditional battle cry that terrified Allied forces across the Pacific. But as they charged up the slopes of the ridge, they encountered something General Kawaguchi had not anticipated in his tactical planning. The Marines didn't break, they didn't retreat. They opened fire with disciplined precision that transformed the hillside into a slaughter zone. Bassilone's machine gun began its deadly work at 800 yards. The heavy slugs from the Browning cut through the advancing Japanese like a scythe through grain. The water-cooled barrel allowed for sustained fire that bolt-action rifles simply couldn't match, and Bassilone had positioned his gun to cover the primary approach route. Each burst sent 5 to 7 rounds downrange in less than 2 seconds, and at that range, every round that found its mark was fatal. The Japanese assault had been planned according to traditional infantry doctrine, emphasizing speed and shock. Kawaguchi's forces were supposed to close the distance quickly, using darkness and overwhelming numbers to compensate for their limited firepower. But the ridge's terrain worked against them in ways no amount of reconnaissance could have predicted. The Marines had spent weeks studying every approach, every fold in the ground, every piece of cover an attacking force might use. Private McCard sighted his Springfield rifle and squeezed the trigger, watching a Japanese soldier stumble and fall 50 yards downslope. The young Marine worked the bolt smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge and chambering a fresh round with the mechanical precision that months of training had burned into his muscle memory. Around him, the distinctive crack of American rifles created a steady rhythm punctuating the deeper roar of the machine guns. What Kawaguchi had fundamentally misunderstood was the nature of American defensive doctrine. Japanese military thinking emphasized the spiritual superiority of the attack, the belief that determined infantry could overcome any obstacle through sheer force of will and courage. American doctrine focused on maximizing firepower and creating interlocking fields of fire designed to destroy attacking forces before they could close to effective range. The Marines had transformed the ridge into a fortress engineered to exploit every advantage modern weapons could provide. The Japanese forces, advancing up the southern approaches, encountered their first devastating shock when American mortar rounds began falling among their ranks. Corporal Watanabe pushed forward through the dense jungle undergrowth, his squad spreading out behind him as American artillery thundered overhead. The Marines had spent the daylight hours preparing for exactly this moment, plotting every approach route, measuring the distances, calculating their fields of fire with precise mathematical certainty. Now that darkness had fallen, their preparation became devastatingly apparent. High explosive shells erupted among the tightly clustered Japanese formations with surgical accuracy, their lethal blast radiating outward through the packed ranks of soldiers struggling uphill through the tropical growth. Bullets whistled past Watanabe's head while mortar fragments sang through the overhead canopy, clipping branches and sending showers of leaves spiraling downward. The veteran sergeant had led assault teams across the Pacific before, participating in night operations that had claimed American positions repeatedly. This engagement felt fundamentally different. The American fire wasn't the panicked, desperate shooting of frightened defenders firing blindly into darkness. These Marines were shooting with discipline and purpose. Their bullets found targets with terrifying consistency, and Japanese soldiers were falling faster than fresh waves could advance. General Kawaguchi was beginning to grasp the harsh reality as his second assault wave emerged from the jungle. The ground before them resembled a nightmare landscape, carpeted with fallen comrades from the initial attack. The Marines hadn't merely stopped the first push. They'd shattered it with such professional efficiency that the attacking force had already begun breaking apart into smaller, uncoordinated groups. American marksmen were systematically hunting down the experienced squad and platoon leaders, the skilled, non-commissioned officers who served as the backbone, holding Japanese units together. The Americans studied muzzle flashes, analyzed movement patterns, and executed targets of opportunity with methodical precision. Colonel Edson stood at his command post, receiving continuous updates from his subordinate officers while directing artillery strikes from Henderson Field. He comprehended that this represented far more than a probing attack. Kawaguchi had committed substantial forces to this operation, and the enemy's relentless pressure suggested they considered the ridge strategically vital. Yet Edson also recognized that the Japanese were repeating fundamental tactical mistakes, and his Marines possessed the training and firepower to capitalize ruthlessly on every error. The artillery batteries positioned at Henderson Field had already registered their guns on predetermined grid squares surrounding the ridge. Now those weapons began unleashing their destructive power with remarkable accuracy. The massive 155mm howitzers hurled explosive shells downrange, guided by forward observers maintaining constant radio contact with the gun crews. Every detonation created a lethal burst of fragmentation capable of neutralizing enemy soldiers across a 40-yard radius, and the guns maintained a steady rate of 4 rounds per minute. Japanese doctrine emphasized infiltration and close-quarters assaults, but the terrain surrounding the ridge offered precious little concealment for large military formations. The Marines had systematically cleared fields of fire extending 300 yards outward in all directions, establishing killing zones where attacking forces would face massed fire from multiple defensive positions. Even shrouded in darkness, Japanese muzzle flashes betrayed soldier positions to American gunners who'd been trained to track targets by sound and light signature. When the third Japanese assault wave materialized, they encountered an increasingly sophisticated defensive strategy that Edson was implementing. This innovative approach would later become standard doctrine for American forces throughout the Pacific Campaign. Rather than simply holding fortified positions passively, Marine squad leaders orchestrated limited counterattacks designed to shatter Japanese formations before they could assemble coordinated strikes. Veterans like Barcelona led these small unit actions, preventing enemy soldiers from gaining the close-range firing positions needed to threaten the ridge's defenders. Kawaguchi's attacking force found themselves ensnared in a tactical situation their training hadn't prepared them to encounter. The Americans weren't following established patterns from previous engagements. They refused to retreat under pressure or collapse when confronted by determined assault. Instead, the Marines fought with professional competence, systematically transforming every Japanese advantage into a crippling disadvantage. The volume of fire American weapons sustained proved absolutely decisive as the battle stretched into its second hour. Japanese infantrymen, armed with bolt-action rifles, discovered themselves severely outgunned by Marines possessing not merely superior firepower, but the tactical expertise to employ that firepower with devastating effect. Browning machine guns synchronized with mortar and artillery fire created an interlocking lattice of destruction that no quantity of individual bravery could penetrate or overcome. By midnight, Kawaguchi's assault had completely lost momentum. His scattered and disorganized forces spread throughout the jungle approaches to the ridge. The general now confronted a devastating choice. He could continue committing his remaining soldiers to what had become a meat grinder, consuming his troops with appalling casualty rates. Or he could acknowledge his initial strategy had failed fundamentally and devise entirely new tactics for combating an enemy behaving nothing like their preconceived expectations. The jungle surrounding the ridge fell into an eerie quietness as the fourth Japanese assault wave disintegrated into small groups of exhausted survivors, limping back through the undergrowth. Kawaguchi had already committed more than 1,500 men to these assaults, yet the ridge remained securely in Marine hands. However, the general refused to accept defeat. In the pre-dawn hours of September 14th, he prepared to gamble everything on a final coordinated assault intended either to smash through the Marine defenses or annihilate what remained of his combat force. Edson moved carefully through his defensive positions, evaluating ammunition supplies and repositioning his Marines to seal gaps that hours of continuous fighting had created along his perimeter. The Marines had demonstrated extraordinary capabilities, though exhaustion was beginning to show. Private McCard had expelled over 100 rounds from his Springfield rifle, substantially more ammunition than typical Marines fired during entire months of training. His shoulder ached from sustained recoil punishment, and his fingers trembled noticeably as he loaded 8-round clips by touch in the darkness. Ammunition shortages posed Edson's most pressing concern. Bessalone's machine gun crew had discharged nearly 3,000 rounds, replacing their weapon's barrel twice despite the water-cooled design specifically engineered to prevent overheating. The gunnery sergeant confirmed approximately 500 rounds remained in reserve, adequate for another intense engagement, but insufficient for prolonged combat operations. Similar situations existed across the ridge at other machine gun positions, with each crew carefully rationing their remaining ammunition supplies. Kawaguchi had internalized the lessons from his earlier failures. His final assault reflected substantially more sophisticated tactical thinking regarding American defensive capabilities. Rather than hurling mass frontal assaults that played directly to Marine strengths, he subdivided his remaining soldiers into smaller infiltration units, tasked with penetrating the American perimeter and striking simultaneously from multiple directions. The Japanese would abandon the psychological power of traditional banzai charges for tactics offering genuine possibility of succeeding against disciplined defenders. When Marine listening posts began reporting movement from previously quiet sectors, the new Japanese approach became evident. Small enemy squads were methodically working their way around the ridge's flanks, utilizing ravines and thick vegetation for concealment during their approach. These soldiers carried light weapons and grenades, intending to approach sufficiently near the Marine positions to destroy critical defensive assets like machine guns and mortars through coordinated surprise attacks. Edson responded by extracting his reserve forces from their secondary positions and deploying them against the infiltration threat. These represented his most capable Marines, warriors who had repeatedly demonstrated proficiency fighting in small detachments without direct supervision. They moved through the jungle with the silent competence of practiced predators, applying their terrain knowledge to intercept Japanese forces before reaching the ridge. The fighting that erupted bore little resemblance to the earlier assaults. Individual Marines encountered Japanese soldiers in vicious close-quarters combat, sometimes with enemy infiltrators positioned only 30 yards from critical defensive installations. Macquart detected movement in the undergrowth beside him and spun to discover a Japanese infiltrator rising from concealment, clutching a grenade. His rifle discharged sharply once, the enemy soldier collapsed instantly, his grenade tumbling harmlessly downslope to detonate among the lower trees. Basiloni's gun position came under direct assault when a Japanese squad successfully maneuvered within grenade range of his machine gun nest. The gunnery sergeant and his crew resisted with pistols and rifle stocks as enemy soldiers stormed their sandbag fortifications. A Japanese soldier nearly reached the machine gun itself before Basiloni cut him down with Thompson's submachine gun fire, the corpse pitching across the weapon's tripod. The savage close-quarters combat created confusion throughout the defensive perimeter, simultaneously exposing the critical flaw in Kawaguchi's revised tactics. By dispersing his forces into smaller infiltration groups, the general had sacrificed the concentrated mass and momentum essential for breaking through established defensive lines. Rather than massing his remaining strength against a single critical point in the American line, he distributed his forces across multiple targets, enabling the Marines to eliminate each group separately. Artillery continued playing a crucial role, though now forward observers sometimes stood mere yards from active combat zones when calling in fire missions. The proximity of combatants demanded perfect timing and exact navigation to prevent striking friendly Marines. Searchlights suddenly illuminated the jungle in brief, hellish flashes, revealing Japanese soldiers desperately scrambling for cover among twisted tree roots and fallen logs. The battle had evolved into precisely the fighting style that favored American training and equipment. Marines excelled at small unit engagements requiring creative problem-solving and individual judgment. Their weapons featured sustained firepower and short-range accuracy. Their tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive counterattacks, preventing enemy consolidation or the establishment of effective firing positions. As dawn approached, the battle's character shifted dramatically. Kawaguchi's infiltration strategy had failed, producing any breakthrough, and sunrise would expose his surviving forces to withering fire from Marine positions commanding outstanding fields of view. The general confronted the grim reality of continuing attacks in full daylight against defenders already demonstrating their capacity to inflict staggering casualties. The Japanese commenced withdrawal shortly after 5 o'clock. Mortar fire covered their retreat, though coordination proved poor and effectiveness disappointing. Marine observers watching through field glasses witnessed scattered enemy formations moving back through the jungle, abandoning weapons and wounded soldiers in their desperation escaping the slaughter surrounding the ridge. Edson commanded his forces to hold their positions and avoid pursuit operations, risking ambush or leading troops into concealed enemy defenses. The colonel recognized his fundamental mission remained defensive, and he had accomplished that mission with remarkable tactical success, exceeding reasonable predictions. His 800 Marines had not merely defended their ground against overwhelming numerical superiority, they'd virtually obliterated an enemy force triple their own strength. The battle's aftermath revealed the devastating scope of Japanese defeat. Patrols counting enemy casualties discovered over 700 bodies littering the ridge approaches, with substantially additional wounded soldiers removed during the withdrawal. American casualties remained below 50 killed and wounded, a casualty ratio that would have seemed impossible examining the initial force distribution. Kawaguchi's defeat at the ridge effectively shattered Japanese offensive momentum on Guadalcanal, commencing a strategic transformation defining the remaining Pacific War. The Marines had conclusively demonstrated that prepared defenders equipped with superior weapons could defeat numerically overwhelming attackers regardless of their fanatical fighting reputation. Most significantly, they'd proven American forces possessed the tactical flexibility to exploit enemy weaknesses while leveraging their technological and training advantages. The ridge destined to carry Edson's name had transformed into a graveyard for Japanese aspirations on Guadalcanal. The 800 Marines standing firm had proven that overwhelming numbers meant nothing confronting superior planning, preparation, and experienced leadership. First light painted the jungle canopy in gold and emerald as Edson studied the battlefield spreading below his ridge position. The scene defied every prediction staff officers had made regarding Japanese tactical resilience and combat capability. Bodies scattered across the approaches lay grouped in formations, telling the story of each unsuccessful assault attempt. Their positions marking the furthest penetration achieved by what had constituted one of the most intensive enemy offensives in the entire Pacific War. An almost supernatural silence had descended across the ridge, broken occasionally by tropical birds resuming their morning activities. Private McCard stepped out from his fighting hole for the first time since dawn broke 6 hours earlier. His legs felt uncertain at first, struggling to remember their purpose after being locked in that cramped defensive crouch throughout the endless night. The young Marine stood looking out across the devastated terrain with eyes hollowed by exhaustion, carrying the weight of something no training could have prepared him for. The raw industrial scale of death spread out before him. Everywhere he looked, the evidence of the night's violence surrounded him. Japanese rifles lay abandoned in the dirt, their long bayonets still attached, light mortars scattered uselessly among the fallen, canvas bags torn open and spilling a man's final possessions across the jungle floor. Over at another position, Bessalone worked methodically on his machine gun, running cleaning patches through the barrel to strip away the thick carbon buildup that comes from firing round after round without stopping. Nearly 4,000 rounds had poured through that weapon during the engagement, yet it had never faltered. The water cooling system had kept the gun functioning when lesser weapons would have seized from the heat of constant use. But Bessalone knew that a reliable gun meant nothing without the tactical mind to employ it properly. He had proven something important during those long hours. That American machine gun doctrine, when used with discipline and understanding, could tear through attacking infantry with devastating results. As Marine patrols began working their way through the jungle terrain, the full extent of what had happened became clear. Kawaguchi had thrown approximately 3 full battalions at this ridge, around 2,500 men drawn from some of his best combat units. When the fighting ended, fewer than 800 remained capable of any organized fighting, and many of those were wounded or completely separated from their commands after the chaotic scramble to escape. What made this defeat particularly significant went beyond just the numbers. These weren't untested recruits or rear-area troops stationed far from real combat. These were seasoned fighters who had seen action in the Dutch East Indies and fought through the Philippines campaign. Japanese military planners had considered them essential for offensive operations against American forces. Losing such experienced soldiers represented damage that rippled far beyond Guadalcanal, striking at the foundation of Japanese military strength across the entire Pacific. Edson's tactical victory held meaning at the highest levels of strategy for both sides. The Americans had proven that Japanese forces could be beaten, that fanatical determination and superior numbers could be overcome through professional training and effective use of firepower. This realization would shape how American commanders approached combat for the remainder of the war, giving them confidence that their preparation and equipment could overcome seemingly impossible odds. For the Japanese, the defeat exposed weaknesses that earlier victories against weaker opponents had kept hidden. Kawaguchi's official reports blamed inadequate artillery and insufficient reconnaissance time, explanations that sidestepped the fundamental issue. Japanese infantry tactics simply couldn't match the firepower and professional skill of American Marines. Interrogators discovered something revealing. Kawaguchi's soldiers had been told to expect minimal resistance, that American defenders would collapse under assault. This miscalculation reflected a dangerous underestimation of American fighting ability that would cost Japan dearly throughout the war. The idea that Western soldiers lacked the spiritual fortitude for sustained combat had just been disproven in the most definitive way possible. The battle's strategic consequences stretched across the entire Pacific conflict. Henderson Field remained in American hands. This meant air operations could continue, gradually choking off Japanese supply lines to their remaining forces on the island. Without reinforcement or resupply, Japanese commanders would face an impossible situation, defending against an enemy that controlled both the sea and the skies above Guadalcanal. For the Marines who had fought on this ridge, the victory justified months of training and tactical methods they'd questioned back in the States. The focus on individual marksmanship, small unit tactics, and coordinated supporting weapons had proven devastatingly effective against an enemy known for military excellence. They had demonstrated to themselves and to observers across the Pacific that American forces could not just match Japanese capability, they could exceed it when properly led and equipped. The cost had been relatively modest by Pacific War standards, yet still represented irreplaceable losses. 43 Marines lay dead from the fighting. Another 97 had been wounded seriously enough to need evacuation. Each casualty represented years of training and experience that couldn't be quickly replaced. These tactical victories that achieved major strategic objectives while keeping friendly losses manageable were priceless in a long war. Edson's leadership during the battle would become legendary within the Marine Corps. His willingness to let Japanese forces nearly surround his position had looked like suicide to those who didn't understand the defensive power of elevated terrain. By forcing attackers to move uphill against prepared positions, he'd multiplied American firepower advantage while neutralizing Japanese strengths. The ridge bearing his name would stand for far more than just another tactical win. It represented a turning point in the Pacific War, the moment when American training, equipment, and leadership began to demonstrate clear superiority. American forces had shown they could overcome any numerical advantage or fighting spirit their enemies possessed. That lesson learned in Guadalcanal's jungles would carry forward through every island campaign ahead, all the way to Japan itself, carried by Marines who had witnessed something fundamental change on this small piece of ground. At Japanese headquarters, the radio reports arriving throughout the morning of September 14th painted a picture Kawaguchi could scarcely accept. His brigade, over 3,000 strong when it departed just days earlier, had been effectively destroyed as an organized force. Commanders still in contact reported casualties above 60%, with entire companies reduced to fewer than 20 soldiers fit to fight. The 35th Infantry Brigade, once regarded as among the Imperial Army's finest formations, had been shattered in a single night. Survivors straggled through the jungle in scattered groups, many burdened with wounded men who slowed the retreat and made them targets for pursuing Marines. Japanese military doctrine had never prepared for large-scale withdrawals. Victory or death had always been the expected outcomes. Now Kawaguchi faced the unprecedented challenge of salvaging what remained of his brigade while preventing complete organizational collapse. Captain Suzuki, among the few surviving company commanders, had watched the final assault from a forward position that gave him a clear view of American defensive lines. His report to brigade headquarters described Marine units that maintained disciplined fire even as Japanese soldiers closed within 20 yards. The Americans never panicked, never lost coherence. They answered each attack with coordinated counterfire that eliminated targets with methodical precision. American signals intelligence, monitoring Japanese radio traffic, detected the rising desperation in enemy transmissions as commanders tried to account for scattered units. Intercepts revealed that Kawaguchi had lost communication with more than half his subordinate formations, many destroyed so completely that no survivors remained. Units that did report back all told the same story: devastating losses and complete tactical collapse. The defeat forced Japanese high command to reconsider their entire strategy. Kawaguchi's brigade had been meant as the spearhead for a larger operation to recapture Henderson Field and eliminate American air power in the region. Its failure revealed that Tokyo had dangerously underestimated American defensive capability. Marine reconnaissance patrols moving through the jungle found equipment and bodies scattered across several square miles. Abandoned rifles lay everywhere, discarded to speed retreat. Mortars stood silent where their crews had fallen. Personal effects littered every trail leading away from the fighting. Intelligence personnel catalogued captured weapons and documents, building a complete picture of Japanese organization and equipment that would inform future operations. Private Macquard joined one of the patrols pushing beyond the perimeter to measure Japanese losses. What he witnessed that day would remain burned into his mind forever. Bodies of enemy soldiers lay in positions that told the story of each failed assault. Equipment scattered in patterns that showed the intensity of American defensive fire. Many Japanese positions bore the marks of artillery and mortar strikes. Entire squads eliminated in single explosions that left craters surrounded by wreckage and remains. Bessalone examined the captured Japanese weapons with professional interest. The rifles and machine guns showed excellent workmanship, but reflected different design philosophies. American weapons emphasized sustained firing capability and reliability. Japanese designs prioritized accuracy and ammunition conservation, reflecting their distinct tactical approach and manufacturing constraints. The battle's strategic implications resonated through both military establishments. American generals saw confirmation that their peacetime training and doctrine actually worked in combat. Small unit leadership, individual marksmanship, and coordinated use of supporting weapons had proven devastatingly superior against a renowned opponent. Japanese commanders faced the harder task of explaining how elite infantry had been destroyed by a numerically inferior enemy from defensive positions. Japanese military tradition emphasized spiritual strength and aggressive tactics as victory's foundation, concepts that had proven powerless against American firepower and tactical skill. The defeat forced recognition that technology and professional training could overcome advantages in numbers and fighting spirit. Kawaguchi's own career illustrated the broader consequences of defeat. The general, once regarded as one of Japan's most capable commanders, found his reputation destroyed. Tokyo's leadership viewed the disaster as evidence of failed leadership and poor judgment, assessments that missed the fundamental problems with Japanese doctrine and strategic assessment that had made defeat inevitable. American corpsmen examining captured wounded soldiers discovered many suffering from malnutrition and tropical diseases that had sapped their combat ability. Japan's supply system, already strained by vast distances and American air attacks, had failed to maintain forces at full strength during extended island campaigns. American casualties, though mourned by the units that suffered them, represented an exchange ratio exceeding 20-1, validation of every tactical decision made during the engagement. The 43 Marines killed and 97 wounded had inflicted losses reflecting both the ridge's defensive advantages and American weapons and tactics superiority. News of the victory reached the United States at a moment when public confidence in the Pacific War remained uncertain. The Marine triumph provided concrete evidence that Japanese forces could be defeated, encouraging continued support for the military expansion that would ultimately prove decisive. The ridge stood quiet in the afternoon heat, its slopes scarred by battle but no longer contested. For the 800 Marines who had held this ground against overwhelming odds, the victory validated everything their training had promised about warfare, leadership, and the power of disciplined soldiers fighting for a cause they understood and believed in.